You hold in your hand a dangerous weapon loaded with the secrets of 3 women from Gilead. They are risking their lives for you, for all of us. Before you enter their world, you might want to arm yourselves with these thoughts. Knowledge is power, and history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Lena. If you haven't been here before, I make videos about books and social change and whatever the hell I feel like. Today I'm making a video about the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale. Now, I'm gonna come out right and say it at the beginning. I'm a fan of sequels. Lion King 2, better than Lion King 1. Sister Act 2, clearly an improvement. Bridget Jones' Diaries 2. Actually, I think the jury's out on that one, I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm somebody who's not adverse to a sequel. I actually think that it's weird that when somebody sets something up as a series, it's considered noble to finish the series and keep writing into it. But when somebody makes a standalone and then adds one, it's like some kind of affront on the universe. I've never understood that mentality. However, this book was written in 1984 and came out in 1985. Those of us who are fans of it had given up on there ever being a sequel. And I think a lot of people, and me partially, felt like we didn't either need or want one because it is so good that it feels perfect on its own. When the publishing house I work part-time at, Vintage Books, announced that we had the rights to publish the sequel, Margaret Atwood had been secretly writing this whole time. Got a bit emotional, as I think everybody in the office did. So this is the very long-awaited The Testaments by Margaret Atwood. It is the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale. I'm going to keep it straight-laced, straight edge, and talk only about the things that I've heard Margaret Atwood talk about herself in talks, and perhaps the stuff that you'd know from the setup of the book, like the stuff that you'd find out early on. If you haven't read the first one, it's set in Gilead, which is a dystopian state that is sitting where the United States should be. The state of Gilead rules under a very old-fashioned version of Christianity, one of which of the elements is the handmaids. The few women who are left who are fertile are given to families essentially as birthing units, really, and are raped in a ritualistic state every month in which the wife is complicit, if not happy about it. FAQs about the book I hear a lot. Is this following Offred, who is the main character in this book? No, it's not. Part of the reason Margaret says, we can call her Margaret, we're on speaking terms, that she didn't want to write a sequel was because she felt like she couldn't recreate that character's voice from this first book. It didn't feel artistically right, it didn't feel correct, it didn't feel good for her. But this book doesn't follow Offred. You might have come across the Handmaid's Tale TV show, which does follow what Offred does after the first book. The first season of The Handmaid's Tale is this first book, and then the other seasons are written by a team of writers at Hulu or whoever makes The Handmaid's Tale. Another criticism that always gets me is when people are like, Margaret Atwood is doing it for the money. If you've heard Margaret Atwood speak and you realise that she lives on a farm with her partner and is very not into money or flashy things or whatever, I think it's a weird notion to think she'd do it for the money. And also, another interesting fact to note is that she's very public about the fact that she makes no money from the Handmaid's Tale series. And they do bring her on as somebody to like consult about the script, but she doesn't really have any control over the script. Apparently, the agency that she was with sold the rights in the 80s when TV was like joke shows, game shows, light-hearted things, and she was like, nobody's ever gonna make a TV show about my weird feminist dystopia. So the rights were taken really, really early on, and they kind of resurfaced recently, and she doesn't get any royalties. So I think for her, intentionally or unintentionally, to reclaim or at least re-interact with this world is completely her prerogative, and something that I'm really excited to hear about. Again, I think with sequels, what I battled with while reading this book was what I wanted it to be, and I think it brings up a really interesting discussion about the relationship between the artist and the consumer, and how when we make effective art, the people who consume the art feel like they own it and it's part of them, which is what makes it successful, not in a financial spread all over the world kind of way, but in an interpersonal successful way, and a way that's like, what's the point of making art? Communicating. You communicate effectively because all these people are bloody obsessed with this book. So part of the success of The Handmaid's Tale, I think, is feeling like I want to control the world. Also, I think particularly people feel attached to The Handmaid's Tale because it directly talks to the reader, because it's these records, and she kind of often addresses the reader as somebody who may or may not exist in the future, depending on whether this transcript survives. And you're almost brought into the book as a co-conspirator. You're kind of subliminally asked to judge situations. You're constantly wondering whether you should trust Offred or she's had to change the story to protect herself. There's so much that's missed out. Sometimes Offred's not a very nice character. It's written in a very clever way that brings you in. So as a reader, it's an intellectual gymnastics to put expectations aside and listen to what the creator of this world believes the world to have become. So this book is set 15 years in the future, so ahead of the Offred narrative, which also leaves room for the TV show world to be true and have existed, whilst also this existing within the world 15 years on. The book's front looks like this, the very recognisable bonnet and robe that we know the handmaids to have, but in this really bright lime green. And then on the back we've got this hint of this girl who clearly isn't this person. So that's been an object of speculation for a while, and inside you'll see that we've got these beautiful end papers that have a kind of girl, but then also the handmaid hidden in it. And also this girl that's hidden in the cloak on the front is really interesting, and what people have been speculating about online, because she's so obviously not dressed as a handmaid and is in this stance of hope, that it kind of gives a hint to the mood of the book at least. So the book is written from 3 perspectives. One of them is a girl that lives outside of Gilead in Canada. Canada managed to fight off the wrath of Gilead along with Texas, which is an independent state and is constantly fighting off Gilead and smuggling people out, which I thought was really cool, especially for people who live in Texas. I'm like, by the way, Margaret Atwood's universe, you guys are the best. The second character is a girl who has lived in Gilead her whole life, and part of the training that the handmaids get in this book is all about how it'll be most painful for these people that have been brought from modern America into Gilead. But for the next generation, it's going to be joyous and amazing because they won't know the difference. So they'll be pure and live this pure life without the temptations and grievances of what they've lost before. So it's interesting now for Margaret Atwood to introduce this character that embodies that promise of Aunt Lydia and the horrible aunts that train the handmaids to be handmaids. And the third character is Aunt Lydia herself. Aunt Lydia, I think, features more heavily in the TV show. I haven't seen most of the TV show. I watched 2 episodes and I found it too upsetting. It's very, very graphic. Aunt Lydia isn't somebody that's present in real time in this book, but she's a voice that Offred, the main character, harks back to a lot, and her voice turns up in these moments where Offred's not sure what to think, and then she'll get the voice of Aunt Lydia in her head, like kind of brainwashing her and reminding her of her duties. It was really, really interesting to hear directly from Aunt Lydia's voice, and perhaps that was the most interesting part of the book for me. That was my favourite part. Whether that could have sustained a whole book on its own, I don't know, but I think from me as a reader's perspective, that's something that I would want, I guess, because I'm a huge fan of the alternative evil woman story, my favourite book being Wicked by Gregory Maguire. In the first book, we learn a little bit about the transition for Offred into Gilead, and in this book you learn a lot more about how Aunt Lydia was before the horrific things that led to Gilead, and how she was absorbed into the society and given the status that she was, even though she was a woman. Very poignantly, you learn in the first book, and it's harked back to in the second book, that Gilead managed to take such a stronghold of the United States because, and soberingly, there is this huge moment in history that it must be akin to like the Twin Towers falling or something in this book, like this big moment where all of the members of Congress are slaughtered, they're publicly assassinated by gunsmen. Everybody blames it on Muslim extremism, and while they're sorting all that out, they suspend the Constitution. It said, that was when they suspended the Constitution. They said it would be temporary. There wasn't even rioting in the streets. People stayed at home at night watching television, looking for some direction. There wasn't even an enemy you could put a finger on. And as you know, Boris Johnson unconstitutionally shut our parliament recently, so... And actually the launch party for this book was on the night that he did that, so that was a weird time to be alive. What the hell was I talking about? I'm being distracted by doom. Doom. I think the Aunt Lydia thing is really interesting, and actually it made the thoughts I was already having on that expand even more, because just before I read this, I listened to the audiobook of The Handmaid's Tale, because I've read it in physical a few times and I wanted something different. Elizabeth Moss, who plays Offred in the TV show, reads the book, and it's just, it'll take your breath away. And in it, I was reflecting a lot on how Offred isn't a hero character. She's not a Katniss from the Hunger Games. She's not Jo March. She's not Elizabeth Bennet. She's not a heroine. She wasn't a feminist before Gilead. She had a mum who was a feminist who she didn't get on with. She had a friend who was really bolshy and kind of was involved in a lot of protest stuff. And she kind of just sat there. She didn't worry too much about it. She didn't believe that her rights were threatened. Even when she's in Gilead, she does the things, or rather doesn't do the things. She makes the choices that we, in our best selves, hope we wouldn't make. We hope that we wouldn't lie down and take it. We hope that we wouldn't hear about a resistance and not want to be involved in it. But Margaret Atwood does this incredibly empathetic thing that really, I think, is born of all the incredible research she's done about the actual totalitarian regimes and horrible things that happen to women in the world presently and in history, and shows us the real fear and the conflict between personal safety and universal good. You think you die for a cause. What the book shows you is when you're not looking back at it in retrospect, it's very hard for you to be able to tell whether you're dying for the cause or dying for no reason at all. Margaret Atwood started writing the book The Handmaid's Tale in 1984, kind of as a response to it being the year that George Orwell had written about in 1948. She was living in Berlin at the time, which is an interesting place to write a dystopia, and she was interested in the talks at the time that feminism was over, that women had got what they wanted, and that things she thought were kind of starting to backslide a little bit. And she was asking the question, what would you have to do? What would society have to look like to get women back in the home? Now they're being allowed out of the domestic sphere. How would you get them back in? She also has always made the very chilling statement that nothing in the book is made up. Nothing is an exaggeration. Some people ask her why she has such a sick imagination to imagine these kind of horrible things that are happening in the book. And she's like, I don't make any of it up. They all have a precedence in history, especially in present day. And I just chaired a panel for Equality Now last night, where I had some incredible people on the panel, including the MP Jess Phillips, and she was telling us that she kind of rolls her eyes when people say how unbelievable The Handmaid's Tale is, because she's like, every experience in that book, I can talk to somebody in my constituency who has experienced that in the last year. It sits in an interesting cultural space, I think, because so many people who have privileged or sheltered present lives like mine, that are quite middle class, see it as this big sensational grievous thing. And for a lot of people, even in our own country, even in our own constituencies, even in our own postcode, it's a huge reality. It's horrible, but it's not a shock. We know at the end of the book, because of this lecture, actually, which is where a lot of the comparisons about the history of brutality and control and torture, they're all in this fictional essay that's part of the book at the back, which looks back at Gilead as a historical document in 2000 million, which probably I'll have to bloody live through and then feel really old. 2195, perhaps not, but soon. Yeah, there's a lecture at the back that's set in 2195, looking back at Gilead as a historical thing. So we already know that Gilead falls. This book asks the question, how do you make something like that fall? And who's pulling the bricks out? It's not always the people you think. What I think is interesting is that dystopia is a relative term. One society's dystopia is another society's meat, or whatever. Dystopias reflect what our society is really scared about. The Handmaid's Tale looks widely at society, but it really focuses quite claustrophobically on this one character and you losing personal autonomy, and that being a universal experience. Having to go into survival mode, not be able to trust anyone, be completely stuck in a regime you had no part in building. It's interesting to me that this book chooses to not stay with one character in this quite literal bonnet of experience, and it does widen things out. What surprised me about it was the difference in pace and the difference in tone, and I actually think it's a really great choice. It makes it a very different book to The Handmaid's Tale. It might be that what you enjoy about The Handmaid's Tale is not the same things that you enjoy about The Testaments. Because it's told from three perspectives, it's very pacey. There's lots of cliffhangers and moments of oh my god. It has less reflective passages and more pacey plotting, and the themes within it are preying on what I think are our present fears. Not just that we will end up in this dystopian society, or that we secretly already live in it and we don't know that. Worse, we don't act like it. The contrast between this girl's world and her separation from the world of the converts in Gilead is is a really prescient one. I think because we're becoming so global and because we feel so connected, there's an anxiety about being separated by borders, by not being able to get across, by being stuck in your own country. And like the Berlin that Margaret Atwood was writing in, that you're separated by a wall. Somebody that you care about is on the other side of that line. And it also plays into the anxiety and fear that our enemies are in fact human. Margaret Atwood spends a long time humanising Aunt Lydia, making you question whether you would do the same. We learn very early on that before Aunt Lydia was Aunt Lydia, she was a lawyer and she dealt a lot in women's cases and she wanted to protect women and she was very, very highly respected in her field. Also that she comes from a very working class background and has a lot of imposter syndrome around being allowed there, and that she grew up in a trailer park, and it's I won't give anything else away, but like, geez, if you weren't going to read the book, like, read it for that. Read it for getting inside a perspective of a woman who you don't perceive as being on your side. Some people mean collective good for the world, but are willing to mean the individual harm to get there. It's a head scratcher. I watched the National Theatre talk with Margaret Atwood that was screened in cinemas, and Margaret Atwood talks about the historical precedent for women's reinforcement units, her research into that, and also into Thomas Cromwell, who she kind of like compares in some ways to Aunt Lydia as somebody who was very much complicit in a system and ran the system and administered all the horrific things, but also had his own private thoughts, his own private world that didn't always correlate with that. That he was also somebody who had built his way out of poverty and the class aspects of that. So yeah, I found Aunt Lydia's narrative the most interesting. I want to talk more about the other narratives, but I don't want to give away too much. I think overall what I got from this book was how bloody enjoyable it was to read, how much of a contemporary book it is, how readable it is, how accessible, how Margaret Atwood's writing can change and grow, and she can still come out with these incredibly profound phrases that I was just like, yep, that's going to be on a mug one day. Somebody's going to crop stitch that. So yeah, I was really happy with it. What enhanced the experience for me was seeing the reaction to even the idea of a sequel among the fandom. So we've been building up to the release at Vintage for like a year and a half. The publicists and marketers have been working incredibly hard on it, and actually it's been so under wraps that only like 3 people in the office were allowed to read it. So those people just had to like very secretly kind of allude to things for us, but they weren't allowed to tell us anything about what happened. It was this big secret in the office that we were all like, oh God, and I finally got to read it just before it came out, and it was such a thrill to be at the midnight launch. Me and Naomi did the social media for the launch, and we were kind of running up and down the stairs the whole time. The relaunch was in Waterstones, Piccadilly, 5 floors of different Margaret Atwood themed activities. Let me see if I can remember what we had. On the first floor, we had a soapbox stage where lots of prominent women would come and share their thoughts on different topics. So we had Caroline Credo Perez, we had Charlie Cox reading poetry. It was amazing. On the second floor, the WOW Festival, Women of the World Festival, took over, and I was part of a mentoring speed dating event, so kind of like speed dating, but for women who want to get stuff done. So I was a mentor there. I got to sit on a chair and meet all these incredible people, give them advice, they gave me advice. That was really amazing. On the third floor, there were talks. There was an incredible panel that featured Neil Gaiman and Jeanette Winterson that's on YouTube. I'll leave the link below. Oh, I forgot, in the basement, they were recording an episode of The Guilty Feminist with Deborah Frances-White and Amanda Palmer. That's going to be released soon. I cannot wait. On the 4th floor, they filled the whole of the bookshop floor with beanbags, and they screened the Handmaid's Tale TV show. So anyone who wanted some time out could just sit there and watch the TV show until midnight. And then on the 5th floor, we had craft activism, making placards, sewing different things. That was really lovely. And the whole night was just full of this kind of electric air. And it really spoke to me about the impact that Margaret Atwood has had. I haven't seen that kind of excitement about a book coming out since the Harry Potter series, really. Somebody described it as a kind of Beatle-esque kind of fever around her visit, and how unfazed she was by all of it, how happy yet slightly confused I think she looked when she unveiled the books. Like, why do people... You can just tell that she really cares about the writing and the books and the ethos behind it and the research. And for somebody who hasn't pushed themselves out there and isn't a razzle-dazzle kind of glittery showman when it comes to personal branding, the dedication and the loyalty and the fever around her was like really infectious. What's even better about that is her insistence that things can get better. Like, she knows so much about how horrible things are for people in the world right now and how much we ignore it, and she's particularly been taking the climate change thing seriously a lot longer than most of us have. And she just said at the end of her National Theatre talk last night, giving up isn't an option. We're witnessing a world that's living through a lot of doom and gloom at the moment, and it's hard to stay hopeful. We know from the first book that Gilead ends, and we learn in the second book about the people who are resisting. And if that is not a book for our times, I don't know what is. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. I really hope you read the Testaments. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And generally what you think about sequels. Do you like them? Do you hate them? Do they have conditions to them that you'd like the author or artist to follow? If you'd like bespoke book recommendations from me and joining a chatty community of people, as well as a free poetry collection and lots of other things, you can join the Gumption Club. It's a Patreon only group, and they're the people that gifted this video to you. They're the people that make these videos happen. So thank you to them. I'm gonna leave lots of links to the cool talks and podcasts about the book below, so you can have a little check out of those, and I will see you in my next one. Frog Snug out.